Hi everybody, welcome back to Newton Community Farms YouTube channel. My name's Hope. We have Jay behind the camera today.
Hello.
And today we're going to be talking about harvesting, specifically cut and come again harvesting. So crops that you can harvest a little bit each time you go out in the garden, each time it's ready, and it'll continue producing. So before we dive in and talk about that, just a reminder that we still have our Healthy Harvest bags for sale every Friday. You can order through the website, pay through the website, and set up your pickup time for Friday afternoons also through the website. Every week it's different. The contents are different based on what's being harvested at the farm, and the price changes every week too. So other than that, let's start talking about cut and come again harvesting. So like I said, cut and come again harvesting is when you want to harvest a little bit of a crop, but not the whole thing, and it'll continue producing so that you can keep harvesting as you go along. So a couple of examples of good cut and come again harvesting items are kale and chard. So that's what we have today, and that's what we'll take a look at. So we're filming today. It's a beautiful Tuesday. It's 90 degrees almost. And it's about 2 in the afternoon. If I were harvesting greens at any time that I wanted to, I wouldn't harvest them at 2 p.m. on a 90-degree day. And the reason for that is because they've been sitting in the sun for the whole day, so they're getting as warm as we are in the sun. And as soon as we cut them, and you can probably see they're already wilting a little bit, as soon as we cut them, they'll continue to wilt. So if you have the choice and if you have the ability, it's nice to harvest early in the morning before the heat sets in. Otherwise, if you're kind of limited to one window, and today we are with recording, I brought out a big bucket with some cold water in it. So I'm gonna harvest my greens and just kind of stick the stalks in that water while we finish talking. And then my next step after we're done talking on here on YouTube, I'll bring them inside and cool them down in some cold water. So if you want to come on over this way. So we have here a mixed bed of rainbow chard. So as you can see, some have more colors than others. This one's a little bit paler with some pink, and the one behind it has some magenta. So this is our rainbow chard, and then right next door is our curly kale. So these are two really common cut and come again vegetables. And I'll show you what I mean with cut and come again. So we'll take a look at this kale here on your side over there. So you can see that the bigger leaves on the plant, so this is like about the size of my hand, a little bit bigger. You can see that these are growing on the bottom of the stalk and toward the outside of the plant. And typically when they've been left on the plant too long, they'll start to droop out like these two. So you can either pick those and take them in to eat, or you can just like leave them in the path. I would probably eat these, so I'll hang on to them. So if we look at the center of the plant, you can see the smaller leaves coming in. So they're really bunchy and curly. And toward the very center of the plant, you can hardly tell that they're leaves, they're so tiny. So kale, and same with chard, produces new leaves continuously through the center of the plant like this. So the more you harvest from the outside of the plant, the more A, signals that you're sending to your plant to continue producing more leaves, and B, the more nutrients and resources and water are available for the new leaves that the plant is growing. So for harvesting, I would just go toward the base of my plant, and you know, this one's a little small, I'd probably toss that, and same with that. But this leaf looks nice. So I'm just breaking it off, adding it to my pile. And kind of breaking it off with your fingers is fine. I would also suggest like maybe having a knife. So I have this one here, and if you don't want to rip it off, if your plant feels fragile, you can just give it a little slice, and voila, you have your kale. So the same tactic is true with chard. So let's look at this bright orange chard here. As you can see, the leaves on the outside are pretty large, And there's even some drooping leaves down here that have kind of passed their prime. So it's best to just prune those off because all they're doing is taking resources from the rest of the plant. And then if we look in the center of our chard here, we can see the same thing we saw on the kale. We have some smaller leaves growing, really teeny ones growing right from the center. And we want to make sure that we have plenty of resources available for those new leaves. So what I'm going to do here is the same thing I did for the kale. With or without my knife, I'll just break off a stalk and set it aside. And sometimes with chard, on the first harvest, it tends to be a little bit tougher to break the stalks off. So you might want a knife for your first chard harvest. Just going to the base of your plant, making a cut, and then you've got your chard. So those are two examples right here in this bed of cut and come again harvesting. And as you can see with a lot of these plants here, they're getting pretty bushy. So with this kale, for example, I would definitely want to clean this up quite a bit so that we can see a little bit more of the inside of the plant and so that the leaves aren't resting over each other and kind of hogging all the sunlight and blocking each other's growth, essentially. So let's look back at this first plant that I started harvesting. I might take another 2 leaves from this plant, the 2 bottommost outer leaves. We'll put them aside. And then when we look at our plant, again, that looks pretty good. I might even take this leaf. That would be kind of an aggressive harvest. But now the plant is going to be a little bit happier and the new leaves will have a little bit more access to be able to grow to the things that it needs to grow. So I will take my harvest and I'll bring it over to my bucket. So again, there's some cold water in here and I'll just stick the stalks in. If the leaves fit in too, you can just cool them off, brush them around. And give them a little break from the heat. So I'm gonna leave those there. Usually I wouldn't leave them in the sun, but we're gonna keep walking and talking. So that's one style of cut and come again vegetables. There's also cut greens, which are a little bit different. And I have some over here in one of our raised beds, so I want to show to you what that looks like. It's harvested a little bit different than the way we just harvested kale and chard. But as you'll see here, it's still, once you harvest, it can still come back again. So we have 2 examples side by side, and they're here for 2 different teaching opportunities. So here on the right-hand side, we have cut lettuce, and I'd say that this is on its 2nd or 3rd cut. I've actually lost track. And next to that on the left, there is arugula, which has, as you can see, gone to seed and flowered. So that signals to us that the plant's done producing. The reason it flowered here is I wasn't harvesting it quick enough. So if you leave your crops without being harvested, and this is true also of kale and chard, it will mature and stop producing new leaves and assume that it's done its work and flower and go to seed, and then it won't really be edible anymore. So if you look on the very far side of the arugula, it's not very pretty, but you can see that that bunch of arugula has been cut, and presumably new leaves will pop up in its place. This plant actually might be done producing. The staff here we've all been sharing and kind of cutting for lunch and different things like that. So it's been through a number of cuts. Usually mixes like this can have 2 or 3 cuts. So I'll probably pull that out at some point this week. And I'll definitely pull this out because it's past its prime. But next door we have our cut lettuce, and I'd say that it has another cut in it. So move this out of the way. So as you can see, there's not as much rhyme or reason here in this mix as you see in kale or chard. And by that I mean you can't quite decipher where the new leaves are coming in or where the oldest leaves are, for the most part. So what you do with a mix like this, you take a handful. So I'll just kind of move some to the side, wrap my hand around a little fistful of greens. I'll take my knife, which you'll definitely need for this, and just slice through, leaving a little bit of stem and taking your greens with you. You can pick out the wilty ones, you can pick out the weeds. That's a big piece. And then that's your cut lettuce. And again, this will want to go right in cold water because it's going to be pretty hot and wilty. So when you leave a little bit of stem, especially if it's your first cut, this will just produce new leaves. And before you know it, it'll look like this again. So in that way, cut and come again is kind of magical because you can harvest and leave it and come back and there's more food for you, as opposed to a head of lettuce, which we'll take a look at after this, that you cut once and then you have to plant something else if you want more food. So this is cut lettuce. Arugula would be the same technique, but as I said, this is past its prime, so I'm done harvesting from this patch. And hopefully I'll plant some more and yeah, we can revisit it another time. So cut and come again harvesting applies to greens and also to herbs. So I have two different types of herbs in the garden that I'm going to show today, and we're going to talk about best practices for harvesting those. So I'm just going to drop these greens in the water, and then we'll walk over to this raised bed, which is pretty full right now. As you can see, we've got heads of lettuce over here, we've got a bunch of basil right here, and then these are scallions, which are also ready to be harvested. So with basil, the ideal is for the basil to start bushing out rather than being one tall skinny stalk with just a few leaves on top. So there is a technique for how to harvest basil that can encourage that kind of outward growth, and that encourages more leaves of basil that are growing. So the way that it's done, let's see if we have a good example growing in here. So if you want to zoom in a little bit, let's look at this one. So there's two tall stalks coming up out of either side of the basil. And if you move them to the side, in the middle you can see that there's a little stump that's been cut. So this means I've harvested it. So I came through like a week ago and these weren't here. These two stalks didn't exist. And I snipped like halfway down the plant and took with me the stalk and the leaves on top. So it looked like this. If we can imagine that this leaf is gone and this is the center, I snipped it at the base and it grew out into two leaves. So now rather than one big stalk, I have two. So I'm probably gonna cut one of these stalks. This is starting to kind of flop over and get heavy with leaves. So I'm gonna do the same thing. I'll take my harvesting knife and just slice it. And then that is what I'll take home to cook with. So let's see if any of these haven't been harvested at all. I think they all have. Oh, here's a little one in the front that hasn't. So these are two separate basil plants, but they're just kind of rooted in the same spot. If you can see, they have two separate stalks. So I'm gonna harvest both of these to encourage them to bush out. So I'll take a look at the stem. As you can see, unlike the last plant that we looked at, there's a single stem on this basil plant. So I'm probably gonna cut, you could cut up here, and these two parts of the plant will branch out. Or you could go down here and encourage a lower, bushier growth. So I'm gonna do that. So I'm gonna kind of move these to the side because they'll give me more growth. As you can see, kind of like the kale and chard, there's bigger leaves on the outside and newer leaves on the inside. So I'll leave those two little bundles on the stalk. So I'll take my knife and I'll cut that part off, and then hopefully these will grow in the same way that we saw that original plant growing. So that's a quick overview of basil. I learned this recently. I was cutting my basil just by pinching one leaf off at a time. And it didn't really set my basil plant up to be that happy. So I've been trying this, and this basil looks a lot happier than my first round. So hopefully that works for you too. So we do have another herb that we're going to talk about today, and it's back over this way. And that herb is parsley. So parsley and cilantro are kind of in the same ballpark with harvesting. So this is my little parsley patch. And as you can probably see, it's definitely got some growth that's ready for harvesting. So I'll put my basil to the side. So there are a lot of overlapping leaves on these plants, and that means that they're kind of fighting each other for photosynthesis and for sunlight. So to ease that kind of stress and to encourage more growth from the center, much like I did with the chard and the kale, I'll pick what I can from the outside. So if we want to start at this plant down here. So here are some outer leaves. They're definitely really big. They're a nice dark green. So I'm going to take my knife with this one too. And I think I'll cut away from the plant just so that I don't accidentally cut the whole thing. And I'll just snip some off like that. And I'll probably go around the whole base of the plant, grab hold of any stalks that have really good leafy growth on it, and I'll just kind of set those aside. And the purpose of this, besides having parsley to cook with and to eat and enjoy, is to kind of relieve some of the crowdedness of the plant, to kind of prune it and thin it out. And that not only encourages more growth within the plant, but it also, it's just the best timing to eat your parsley at. So the longer you wait for harvest, the more bitter it will be. And that tends to be true for crops like mustard greens as well. The earlier you harvest, the better. And same with arugula, actually. Like the first harvest that we had of this patch of arugula that I showed you before was really delicious, a great flavor. The second cut was a little bit more bitter and had a little bit more of an edge to it. And the third cut, what I did harvest of the third cut, wasn't as good. It was really, really bitter, and I didn't like it as much. Some folks might prefer more bitter, and if you prefer a little bit more punch in your parsley, you can wait till it's this big. But the earlier you harvest, of course not when it's teeny tiny, but the earlier you harvest, the better or the less bitter your flavor will be. So that's an overview of two herbs that I used to not know how to harvest, and now I feel like I know how to best take care of my plant when I'm harvesting them, which feels good for longevity in the garden. So we have one more crop to show you, so let's move back over to those raised beds. So for the sake of contrast, I want to just show an example of one crop that is not harvested as cut and come again, just so that we all have an idea of what is or is not cut and come again. So in this raised bed, we have two different varieties of lettuce. So on this side is new red fire lettuce. It's like a frilly, kind of curly type. And on this side is Bibb lettuce. It's a really sweet, delicious, crunchy green lettuce. So most of these are getting pretty sizable, and if you look over here, that's the stump that I cut today for lunch. So that is what it looks like when the crop has been harvested. So let's take a look at the Bibb first. So these heads of lettuce can get very big. If you're a part of our CSA, or if you've been buying any healthy harvest bags, you've probably seen a head of this lettuce. We grow it out in the field as well. It tends to get bigger out there. We space it apart further so it has more room to grow. But I kind of crammed more heads in this raised bed than we would do in the field. So that's why they're a little bit smaller than they might otherwise be. So while I'm looking at my lettuce to decide which to harvest, so let's say I'm coming out before dinner and I want to decide what to eat, I'm going to take a look not only at size, but I'm also going to look for, a perfect head of this lettuce will be kind of squat and round. But if we look at these two, you can kind of see that they're starting to move upward rather than outward. And that's what lettuce does before it bolts, which is essentially what we saw on the arugula, which is going to flower or going to seed. And when the lettuce thinks that it's done its job and it's done growing, and especially when it gets really hot out, the lettuce will start to grow upward, and that means that it is bolted. And usually the flavor is just not as enjoyable on lettuce when it's bolted. It can get more bitter, not terribly. I don't always mind it. I would definitely eat this one, but if you've seen a lettuce field that's truly bolted, they can be like all the way up to here. So because these two are kind of on their way to that, but they're still totally fine, I'm gonna harvest this one. So what I'll do with lettuce, with head lettuce, is I'll reach under the plant, I'll move all the leaves out of the way, and I'll kind of pull it to the side. I'll take my harvest knife and I'll just cut along the base like this. And then if you flip it over, you can clean off the leaves that don't look as nice. And then there's your head of lettuce. And as you can see back at the stump here, this won't grow back. So this is a singular harvest crop. So whereas in the bed on the other side of the learning garden where we harvested the cut lettuce, we left a little bit of stump or stalk, and we can trust, because it's mixed greens, we can trust that it'll grow back a couple of times. But with head lettuce, that doesn't happen. So this is an example of a singular harvest crop, just for contrast. When this is, at some point when these lettuces are past their prime or we've harvested them all, I'll move through this bed and just kind of take out those stumps and those little root bodies from these heads of lettuce and plant something new. So it's a little bit more work to grow something that doesn't come again when you begin to harvest, but every crop has its perks and every crop has its challenges. So these are just a few. So I'll definitely want to get this out of the sun as soon as possible. And other than that, that's a quick overview of what it is to harvest a cut and come again crop. And yeah, I hope that your gardens are thriving and surviving the heat. And we'll see you next time. Bye.